Paul, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today, man. For people who aren't familiar with you and the incredible stuff you've been doing, especially in the baseball space, what has it been, like a decade or more now of baseball experience for you that way? Would you mind filling them in a bit about who you are and all the amazing things you got going on, man?
Yeah, and most definitely. Again, great. Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure always to reconnect and just park some good shop. Yes, it's my 16th season in minor league baseball, strength and conditioning. 13 previously with the Cleveland Indians, and then now I was entering my third season with the Detroit Tigers.
That's awesome, man. That's awesome. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about baseball that way for you that way. How did you get into working in the sport of baseball? How did you get to, working with guys at such a high level and kind of cultivate the success that you have in the space that way?
Yeah, I mean, I tell you the story now that I tell everybody, and I'm still in contact with these two gentlemen. I was finishing up my undergrad at Cleveland State University. Obviously, I'm born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio. Uh, and I caught wind that they had hired a strength conditioning coach, their first time ever. Went down there and met the gentleman. Shane Levinson was his name. Um, Talked shop with him for a little bit, and another strength conditioning coach that they had there at the time was Derek Millender, which obviously you're friends with Derek. Derek's now with the Cleveland Cavaliers, and I remember speaking with Derek there in his office in the weight room. I said, "Hey, how do I further pursue this career that you're in?" And that's when he had mentioned to me University of South Florida, a gentleman by the name of Ron Kifri, to go down there and help out Ron with an internship. Help out with football and all the Olympic sports. So through Derek Millender, he got in contact with Ron Kifri, went down there and spent a few months with Ron, Coach Mack, and then at the time he approached me one day, said, "Hey, Cleveland Indians are over here in Winter Haven, a few exits away from South Florida campus. If you're interested." And he put me in contact with the powers that be over there, and I went over there and interviewed. And yeah, 2008 was my first year in baseball. But that's kind of how it all started. I happened to be at the right place at the right time.
Yeah, no, I've heard that from a lot of people, and it sounds like you're a product of the people around you at the end of the day. I mean, I can't speak to everyone that you mentioned, but I can certainly speak to Derek. He is just such a fantastic individual that way, and I have nothing but good things to say about him. One of the nicest people I've ever met that way. And I think there's something to be said, and this is kind of a lost art in the space, if you will, in my opinion, anyways, about just trying to help other people, lift other people up, and just trying to kind of get things without expecting anything in return, right? Changing our mindset away from this kind of transactional line of thinking that I think a lot of people are stuck in, and instead just trying to improve the entire space, if you will, and raise the floor and just help other people out along their journeys that way. And I think it's incredible that you've gotten to where you're at because of some of those people. Now, obviously, you can turn around and kind of help and give back to the next generation. And I have a lot of respect for you about that because you do seem like the kind of person that gives freely. And I mean, I know that firsthand just from your time down here in Maryland when you came over the winter months that way. So it's just incredible to see that. And obviously, I think that success and those kind of characteristics lead you into the business space quite well. I certainly think there's a lost art of all of these things in the business side of things as well. Can I trust the company that I'm working with? What are they going to be able to provide for me? Are they interested in my success and so on that way? Now, obviously, you've got a phenomenal product that should solve a lot of problems for people and is well versed or versatile in nature, I guess I should say that way. Where did the idea for Pillar come from for you originally that way? How did this kind of whole business venture and concept get started for you?
Yeah, honestly, I depicted the story. Someone told me to put the story up on my website, in which I did. And there's a photo that I redid the photo, but basically it was in the dugout during one of those minor league seasons with the Cleveland Indians, and I was just watching the game, and the athletic trainer ATC standing next to me from Japan, who uh, shortly after that season went back to Japan to enter their major leagues, Issei Kamada. But it was basically a conversation between him and I. We're watching the game. He leaned up on the railing, kind of propped himself up, and yeah, that was like the sensation we felt. And when he turned to me, and I saw him doing it in the tank, kind of doing like an upright plank, and we were messing out the railing right there in the dugout, and we thought to ourselves, "Hey, what if we go back to the weight room after the game today or then in the coming days, we can somehow mimic, how can we mimic this movement or the sensation we felt here, right? So we tried them on plyo boxing and whatnot. And uh, that was probably the toughest part. How do you create something like that in the weight room just with the equipment you have available? So I basically what I ended up doing was I just made a stick figure drawing. I was living in Columbus, Ohio at the time. Got in contact with a manufacturing company. Rialto is the name. Rialto Manufacturing. Met a guy who's now a good friend of mine, Russ Craig. I gave him the stick figure drawing. I said, "Hey, I'm a strength conditioning coach for the Indians. I thought of this move in the dugout. Can you build this apparatus for me? Or weld this thing together for me?" And a few weeks later, he had one unit built for me. It was funny because he dropped it off from my apartment in Columbus. It was one piece, and you saw the pillar in person. There was no the initial piece had no bolts or screws on it. There was one solid piece. So imagine trying to get that thing like through a door somewhere or something. And then the gauge of steel, I believe we used it was like 13 gauge steel because he had asked me, like, what kind of people you want to use in this thing. I said, anywhere from my players to an NFL lineman weight capacity. So very, very, I still have it in my basement, the original pillar, like extremely, extremely durable, heavy gauge steel. But that's where the thought process came. At that point, once I had it built, I took it back to Cleveland State to my exercise science professor, Dr. Ken Sparks, who also close ties with Derek Millender. We did a lot of work together. And I left it there with him. I said, "Hey, Doc Sparks, I got this idea. And this is the move. As far as I know, it's not even out there on the market. A vertical plank. Everyone does a horizontal plank, but you Google vertical plank, you're gonna see just similar plank moves up against the wall. So I left it there with him, the apparatus, and then he called me a few days later saying that he had a grad student that wanted to complete his dissertation on the unit itself, comparing that vertical plank position, which you're actually angled at 77 degrees, compared to the prone plank. Um, and I don't know if I ever told you, it's angled at 77 degrees because I asked my guy Russ when he built it, and I said, why it's 77 degrees? And he said, well, you got to compensate for the tipping portion of how, like the beams at the bottom, the supports at the bottom, like one side had to be longer than the other. Um, but basically, he went 13 degrees off of 90. That's how we got 77 degrees at that angle. Um, and as you know, when you were in that effort, when you were in the pillar, the plate at the bottom, it's mimicking the floor, preventing your feet from going forward. So yeah, left it there. Matt Ivers is the gentleman's name, another good close friend of mine, colleague with the pillar concept, and he completed a dissertation, did the EMG testing on it with fellow classmates, and all the data was favorably supporting the pillar move, the vertical plank move.
Absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, just thinking about the prone plank, a lot of individuals, in my opinion, don't do it correctly, right? Like, in my opinion, you should not be able to hold a prone plank for 5, 10 minutes or some of these long durations that people are able to do. So it should not be easy. I think Pavel was an influence on your career, just like he was an influence on mine, his books and kind of readings and different things that way. One of the things he discusses, I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe it was in his book, Easy Strength with Dan John, another legendary strength and conditioning figure. They talk about the plank and they talk about how a lot of people, or it might have been hard style abs actually, they essentially outline that a lot of people plank and they're just holding the position and they're like, wow, I'm not feeling anything. And it's because it's not active enough for them, right? In the plank, it should feel almost more like survival in nature. You should be pushing into the ground actively with anything and everything you have, right? Your glutes should be engaged, your quads should be engaged, your feet should be driving into the ground, your arms in that, whether they're straight or in that kind of like bent elbow position that way, they should be pushing the ground away actively. And a lot of people, they don't do that. They don't fire all these different muscles. And in my opinion, they don't get the full benefit of doing a prone plank versus with your apparatus there and more of that vertical position. I feel like it's impossible to do that without engaging those muscle groups because you can't hold the position without driving into the pads with your upper body, without driving into the foot plate with your feet that way. It kind of eliminates this compensatory strategy that I think a lot of us see or find in the plank And it makes it so difficult to coach the plank, in my opinion, right? Because people in the position, maybe it looks good and you're just walking around as a coach and you're like, yo, you feel that, right? And of course they're going to say yes, because who's going to say no, right? A lot of athletes don't do that. They're just like, oh, yeah, I feel it, working my core a bit, whatever that way. And I think until they experience something to the kind of extremes, kind of like your pillar plank that way, because again, I feel like it's very difficult, if not impossible, to compensate with it. As a result, it's a much more gnarly move or gnarly position to hold, if you will, than the traditional planks, in my opinion.
Right. No, definitely for sure. And but I was pleased to hear, like I said, all the everywhere that we had that Matt Ivers and his colleagues there, along with Dr. Sparks and another who actually took over Dr. Sparks now, Dr. Doug Vita, who's also there. He runs everything down there at Cleveland State Exercise Science Lab. Doug Vita. Yeah, it was cool to see all the high percentages of the electrodes from the EMG analysis. And I know when I was there with you in the winter months, we messed around with the ortho, right?
Yeah. And we saw something similar. It was very high engagement from an EMG standpoint, which is obviously always good to see that way. And I think the other piece that comes along with that is it's not just EMG that we're after, because there's a lot of different things that can activate muscle. I think it's not just EMG, it's also the force output that you get. And while we did not assess or measure the force output with any kind of dynamometer or load cell that way, just from kind of how I feel when I do a vertical plank or when I do some of the other variations on the pillar that way, I feel like I'm getting significantly more out of it than I am in a prone plank, a side plank, or some of these other positions that way, right? Because a lot of times people are like, well, the EMG, the muscle activation is high. And it's like, yeah, well, you're looking at the calves during freaking pogos, or yeah, you're looking at the hamstrings during freaking hamstring tantrums, right? It's like, yeah, the activation is high, but the load is minimal to non-existent in those, right? It's not just about firing tissue and activating it from a neural standpoint. It's also the workhorse side of it as well, right? Can we build some legit strength and kind of bulk this area up a little bit, if you will, right? So I think the combination of a high force output with a high muscle activation, and knowing that by nature you're combining isometric principles from overcoming, pushing into the pad, pushing into the handles, if you will, and yielding in the sense that you're holding a position that gravity is actively fighting you on from a vertical position that way, if you will. I think you get kind of the best benefits and best bang for your buck on all accords here, which is very rare for an exercise, right? You get the hypertrophy effect, the neural activation effect, and beyond all in one kind of thing that way, if you will.
Going back, once I had that one unit built, I thought, okay, well, I have one of it built now. We were messing around with the actual design and thinking, and right away, the first critique that I got from it, well, okay, aside from that vertical plane, what else? What else does it do? And then obviously very similar comparisons to the vertical knee raise apparatus that's been around for decades, right? Uh, and right, initially when you look at the pillar, aside from not even seeing the kick plate at the bottom, you're automatically thinking vertical knee raise, or it's sometimes called the Roman chair. Um, but we were messed around with the design. I said, well, shoot, I wonder if there's spacing available on the uprights to make more holes for the side plank variation, and that actually opened up the door to even more movements, more versatility. The side plank varieties. You can even mimic a side plank, vertical Copenhagen, if you will. I think I called it. I was messing around with the David Wex Bosu ball. I put the Bosu ball on the front end of it for when you're in that frontal plank position to do a single leg iso hamstring smash into the Bosu ball. So just trying to be more versatile with the apparatus from the initial design.
Absolutely. I think that's great. Tell me more about those kind of side plank variations, the side Copenhagen and side plank in that vertical position that you outlined that way, because those are both phenomenal exercises that way, right? I think I see the Copenhagen becoming one of the most common exercises used to strengthen the adductors, whether that be in short lever or long lever positions that way. I'm interested to hear more about kind of the side plank and Copenhagen plank variations in the pillar that way, if you will.
Yeah, I think the first thought that comes to mind is really just the joint angles. I've seen even this past week, I've seen some of my players, even during spring training, if they have the Copenhagen in their template, some perform it correctly and some aren't as they don't look as stable. Is the shoulder in a good position? Are they able to hold a good side? Actually, you probably would have to ask that. If you can hold a good side plank position where your joints are stacked, then you could implement the Copenhagen, a true Copenhagen. But a lot of times I see athletes cannot hold a side plank correctly, and then they try to implement the Copenhagen on top of that. Then you see a lot of collapsing going on. Kyphosis starts to set in there in those movements and stuff like that. So, but in the pillar, right? It's an aggressive move, and you've obviously you tried the side plank. It's definitely not for the faint of heart. That move, right? The vertical move itself. If you're a heavier individual, for sure that's going to challenge you. The side plank, because remember you're supported with one arm and then the one foot that's into the kick plate. So extremely, extremely aggressive. Again, we talked earlier a few minutes ago about holding the traditional plank for X amount of time under tension. The side plank for sure. I'm myself included. I'd like to think I'm in decent shape. I'm talking maybe 20 seconds max on the side plank, 25 seconds, and you really, like you said, like you're fighting survival to stay in that position in the side plank.
Absolutely, yeah, and to your point about just the kind of compensatory patterns that we see with a lot of athletes doing side plank and Copenhagen variations, I think people misunderstand athletes and think that they're automatically ridiculously strong and just good in all things because they're an athlete at a high level, when in reality, a lot of times they get there because they're really freaking good at compensating and adapting compensatory patterns that a lot of times we don't want. One of the most notable ones that I see with those side plank variations is a lot of people, especially some of the male athletes I've worked with, turn it into a deltoid exercise more than a hip exercise. And they try and kind of hold themselves up with their upper body instead of actually engaging their lower body that way. And as you mentioned, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to do that with the vertical setup that you have at the angle. It's like you have to engage your lower body or else you're not going to hold the position, period. It's as simple as that. And I think there's a lot of value in those setups, kind of more of like a constraints-based approach, if you will. Those setups that minimize, if not eliminate completely, the compensatory strategies that a lot of athletes tend to fall into, right? You get more out of the exercise. You actually get the intention that you're after from the exercise that you're doing that way. And not to mention, one of the things we talk about a lot, or I talk about a lot on the podcast, is this concept of rep match. And I think a lot of times people become overly reliant on technology, and maybe I'm guilty of it myself, to assess things, right? And sometimes you don't have access to the force plates, the EMG, the, motion capture software, the whatever it is that you're, currently using to assess athletes. Take it all away, assume you have none of it. How are you going to assess them? One of the many things I like is a rep match where you hold a position on one side, maybe a side plank for time, and then you do the same thing on the other side for time, and you compare how long they held them for, right? Or maybe you do a single leg wall sit, left leg versus right leg, and compare the times. It's kind of a little bit more quick and dirty, but I think that's something that could be applied very, very well with the pillar, because now you're able to do that in a position that actually minimizes, if not completely eliminates, the compensatory strategies that a lot of athletes rely on to get to those longer duration holds, right? It's just so difficult to cheat it. They're significantly less likely to do it. So as a result, I know my assessment, even with minimal equipment, even with no technology, is far more reliable and valid than if I was just doing it off of the floor. So I think there's a lot of value in those side variations that you just outlined.
Yeah, most definitely. It's just something I think when I mess around with myself is to like what certain level of fitness or strength do you have to do the side. Again, that vertical, that frontal one is it's challenging in itself. Then you have someone to support themselves on one side, suspended off the ground like that. That's when I look at the design of the way where we're at now, it's 77 degrees. And I'm thinking to myself, the next phase of manufacturing the pillar, it maybe having like three, like having more adjustable settings, to go from 77 to maybe like 70 or 65, of the thought process, just have it adjustable settings, but then again, not to have the tipping go too far where the lumbar starts to come into play, right?
It's always a never-ending battle about
'Cause right
how much freedom do I wanna allow within the adjustments that way. I
'cause
think
right now you're fighting gravity. That's another that's a something I've people that have been in it and have tried just the regular vertical upright one. They say they feel nothing in the lumbar. Everything's on the frontal side of the body and all anterior loading.
yeah, and avoiding some of those low back compensations because that's something that's so common in athletes and even in Gen Pop, right? I think the stat is like 97% of Americans experience lower back pain. It's like, if we can give them an exercise setup that works the tissue that we're after without any kind of lower back pain, lower back flare-ups, or kind of exacerbating any of those things, I'm going to make that transaction every time just because I know how common lower back issues are in all populations. And obviously, I don't want people to have bad experiences with exercise. I want them to kind of fall in love with that process of physical self-improvement that way. You also mentioned about how you incorporate the BOSU into a lot of the work that you do with the pillar that way. Would you mind kind of explaining to people listening how you incorporate the BOSU with that vertical plank variation and what you've seen with that?
Right. So as I mentioned, remember, and you've seen it yourself there firsthand. I took a thinner jump stretch band and hooked it around the bottom on the opposite side of the pillar. So when you're in that upright plank position, that goes to on the front side of it. That allows like for the foot placement, the foot strike for the hamstring ISO, and then also if you're in the side plank, you can push into that Bosu ball for a more aggressive Copenhagen, a scissor move, if you will.
I like that scissor one in particular because now you're kind of combining alternate hip flexion and hip extension. And that's one of the many things that I think everyone agrees is very important to training. Yet for some reason, we very rarely, if ever, train that, right? If I'm flexing on one side, extending on the other, that is essentially the nature of a lot of athletic movements, right? They're reciprocal. One side is doing one thing while the other side does the opposite. So being able to train both of those at the same time with the pillar setup, while also, as we mentioned, keeping the pillar or the core complex nice and fired up and strong and resilient that way. I think that's a movement that has a lot of application for a lot of different settings. And I think the other piece too is, a lot of these things we've discussed so far, you can obviously apply them from a performance standpoint, but I'd also look to apply them from a rehab standpoint as well. I think there's a lot of different applications from your ACL and lower extremity rehabs to your lower back pain clients and so on that way, right? I think a lot of times you get those scripts in the PT clinics that say core to the floor. And a lot of times people go all in on like quads or hamstrings or hips and kind of forget about the core, or they forget about how do we strengthen all of those simultaneously. So I think it has a wide array and broad applications, if you will.
Yeah, yeah. That's why I pretty much, I call it, I nicknamed it the sagittal plane. For all of us anatomy geeks, if you remember the you got the frontal, the transverse, and the sagittal. I call that move the sagittal Copenhagen. Um, so if you say that to someone nowadays, if someone in our industry, hey, you've ever seen a sagittal plane Copenhagen? They'll have to think, okay, these are the planes of the body that we move through, and then you think of sagittal plane, and you think of the word Copenhagen. You have to think in your brain, what does a sagittal plane Copenhagen look like? You know, so that's pretty much what I call that move with the Bosu sagittal plane Copenhagen.
And it sounds like just the overall principles of the pillar combine a little bit of that biomechanical element and a little bit of that neurophysiological element that we discussed, but also lean heavily on the isometrics. But as we've discussed as well, there's a lot of different variations you can do that are not as isometric in nature, right? I've seen some different things that you do, like kind of pushing in with one leg and lifting off with the other, even adding band resistance to that and so on that way. And I think it's important to note that this is not just a biomechanical, neurophysiological, and isometric construct, but there's also ways to incorporate a lot of different, very difficult movements into this. And I think some of those, especially that kind of like that pillar plank with that hip extension element, active hip extension, alternating left versus right, is really, really powerful here.
Right, right. And then also, if you look at the research as far as like hip movement, hip mobility, to really tap into the psoas, the more you can activate the rectus and transverse abdominis, and that's going to free up the psoas.
Are there any other general applications that you've seen for the pillar beyond athletes, rehab, and general fitness clients, or any unique cases in which you've applied the pillar that way so far?
I think just in modern day society right now. I mean, I look at it right now, and you mentioned earlier about posture and everything and lifestyle. I mean, like right now, our hip flexors are flexed, so we're sitting down, and how many people right now are sitting at work in an office or, sitting at a computer, people on their phones. I mean, obviously you're a physical therapist, you heard in recent years, the texting neck, right? How many pounds of pressure on the cervical, uh, area that, from just constant texting head down. So I think about the pillars application, just general population. And my guy, Russ Craig, who obviously, has been along the journey with me, in designing the pillar. He had put on the website the move everyone should be doing right now. I remember he quoted that, the move that everyone should be doing right now. So when I think in those terms, I figure, why not? Why, if the Roman chair slash hip flexor machine is in every commercialized gym, your Planet Fitnesses, your LA Fitnesses, your YMCA's, and I see people still doing the hip flexor movement in that apparatus, then why not provide the option of the pillar to be right next to it? If we're constantly flexing everything, flexing our necks for texting, our hip flexors are flexed, long commutes, sitting in a car, at a computer. Um, yeah, definitely. I think now, as far as like application, the pillar, in my mind, and not to be biased by any means, but I just think, I want to do it the right way and just put that apparatus out there, have it available to everyone who just basically wants to train and just develop good core strength and reinforce better posture.
Do you feel like there's a bit of an educational element required to succeed with the pillar, right? Like, I'm sure someone's going to look at it and be like, oh, wow, it's a fancy thing that allows me to do dips that way. How do you kind of approach the educational requirement needed to use the pillar that way? And how do you think that's going to evolve over time that way?
I think just basically of the comments I just made about the posture and everything and how everyone trains. And, obviously, both of our roles right now, the Palloff press variations are very, very popular, right? But again, and all the Palloff variations, you're still on your feet, which obviously, right, when you're playing a sport or involved in athletics, you're applying force in the ground. But I remember we talked about, like, if you want to deload the lumbar, you know, uh, obviously there's the old school ab straps, right? You can be suspended, hanging leg raises and stuff. But again, how do I perform a suspended isometric core movement to aggressively train the core and not hinder the lumbar in any way, to be suspended. So I think moving forward, that would be my thought process right there. Is you're suspended, gravity, but you're still training at a high level.
And not to mention, in relation to what you mentioned about athletics and training the core complex and a lot being closed chain, I think about a lot of the different core muscle injuries that we see and some of the different demands of sports. And a lot of them involve open chain rotation, where the athlete is in the air, the feet are not on the ground, and yet there's rotation of the trunk and torso complex occurring. That's something that's almost never trained, right? I think about your classic Derek Jeter shortstop type of play here, where he's fielding a ground ball running towards third base and has to jump, twist in the air, and throw across his body to get it over to first base in time, right? Something like that, or something like the sport of volleyball, where the athletes are jumping and twisting while in the air. And I think having that option to train some of these different patterns and muscle groups with your feet not connected to the ground is actually extremely beneficial for sport when you look at the demands of the sports themselves that way, and understanding these open chain rotational type situations like I just outlined produce a ton of force across the body in a plane and in a way in which a lot of us don't typically train it. So I think this opens up the door to kind of close that gap on a lot of those kind of patterns.
Right, right, and that actually comes to mind now. Messing around with the pillar one day, a very, very close colleague of mine and a phenomenal strength and conditioning coach in professional baseball, Phil Hart. He hopped in there, and he actually thought of a move overcoming ISO. So we basically took the handle from the one side of the pillar and placed it in the hole on this. So we had both handles on the same side. And I think I might have showed you this move too when I was down there visiting you in the off season. So basically, you were pulling from the same side, overcoming ISO side plank. So you were in the side plank position, but both handles were together on the same side. It was an overcoming ISO, suspended overcoming ISO. So that now that you just mentioned that comment about Jeter running towards third, leaping off of 1 foot, throwing the first, right? That move right there, that Phil Hart brought to mind. That's another good one. But again, super aggressive move. Not for the faint of heart. Though that's probably the biggest challenge I'm facing right now. Like I mentioned to you before, is the vertical plank in itself is challenging, but then you add in all the varieties that we have designed, and they are effective, but they're extremely challenging.
Absolutely, absolutely. Paul, where do you see Pillar in about 3 to 5 years' time that way? How do you see this kind of evolving as a product and as a business that way?
Yeah, pretty much like I told you before. Every commercial or private gym facility, training facility, the private sector, we've even thought about having like two versions, like a Pillar 2.0 for your high end uh, athletic performance, and then also having a general population that just provides you with the initial moves there. And then if you wanted to build upon it, to just depending on your training age, your level of fitness. But we've talked about having two versions. We're basically the the concept would be was get the initial move out there to everybody, just that sagittal plane, vertical plank.
Absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense, Paul. And for people who are interested in learning more about the product or considering it for their own space that way, where can they find you all at online and social media and so on that way?
Right. Yeah, I have an Instagram page myself there. And then if you just search under Paul Synenkyj, you'll see the pillar stuff come up. And then also our website, www.pillarstrong.com. That's the USB. And then also there is the link, kudos to my guy, Matt Ivers, who did his dissertation at Cleveland State on the pillar. The hyperlink to his dissertation is there. So if anyone wants to dive deep into his dissertation and all the EMG analysis and the studies done, that hyperlink is on the website as well.
That's awesome. Link to all of that in the description below. That way, if you didn't quite catch it, you can just click there and see everything that Paul and the team at Pillar are up to. Paul, is there anything we missed as we were chatting and discussing today, or anything else you wanted to address?
No, I just expressed the challenges of being a strength and conditioning coach and trying to bring a product to life to market. That's the challenge. Is you've been in and out of PT clinics and weight rooms and collegiate weight rooms and professional weight rooms. You look around and you see a lot of tools, whether it's the kettlebells, the center mass bells, Indian clubs. There's umpteen amount of varieties of the foam roller, right? So that's basically the challenge I'm facing right now is trying to implement an apparatus as another tool in the weight room that people can use.
Yeah, no, definitely. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we're in the business of solving problems. And if there's a piece of equipment that helps me solve problems, it's definitely something I want, right? I think you need to have a wide array of tools in your toolbox to solve the wide array of issues that we're presented with, whether that be on a performance side or a rehab side. And obviously, as you've mentioned, I've gotten to play around with the pillar several times and it's gnarly. It definitely challenges you in ways that a lot of traditional core exercises don't. So I certainly think it's a great piece, and I can't wait to see how it continues to evolve in its application in the private sector and with teams and sports that way. So, Paul, this is really awesome. I appreciate your time and I appreciate the opportunity to learn more about the work you got going on, man.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Dan. Thanks so much for having me. I truly appreciate the time.